This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Click the link in the description below and start protecting yourself on the internet today. It's the afternoon on the 12th of June 1972. American Airlines Flight 96, which is flown by a brand new DC10-10 aircraft, is climbing out from Detroit Metropolitan Airport. As the aircraft climbs through 11,750 feet, a loud bang can be heard and part of the aft cabin floor collapses into the cargo compartment below. The whole aircraft fills up with dense white fog, and in the cockpit the pilots are struggling to maintain control of the aircraft. What has actually happened? Well, in order to understand that, we have to look at some of the design features of the DC-10. We're also going to have a look at the heroic actions of both the flight crew and the cabin crew, and we're going to do so with the help of the final report. Stay tuned. American Airlines Flight 96 was scheduled as a multi-stop flight, starting in Los Angeles, then flying to Detroit, after Detroit continuing to Buffalo, and then finally to New York and LaGuardia Airport. In the flight deck, we have a really senior flight crew. Captain Bryce McCormick, 52 years old, has 24,000 hours in total. Together with him was First Officer Peter Whitney, 34 years old, 7,900 hours, and Flight Engineer Clayton Burke, 50 years old and 13,900 hours. There was also 56 passengers and 8 cabin crew on board. The aircraft being flown is a brand new DC10-10 aircraft, which was certified and delivered to its launch customer, American Airlines, less than a year before this incident. Now, the DC10-10 was built for continental travel. It wasn't built for extreme long haul. It had 3 engines, number 1 and number 3 situated under the wings, and number 2 was tail mounted. The flight controls was hydraulically driven, but they were activated by a series of cables and pulleys that ran mainly under the main cabin floor. And when it comes to the doors on the DC-10, the passenger doors was called plug type, which basically means, just like on the 737, that they open inwards. So that when you close them, the differential pressure that you have inside of the aircraft is going to just keep the doors closed in flight. However, the cargo doors was of a different type. These doors opened outwards, and there's a good reason for that, because if you have doors in the cargo hold that opens inwards, they will take up a lot of valuable cargo space behind them. So instead, these doors was open outwards, but the problem that you have with that is that you then need to create some kind of really secure locking mechanism, because all of that differential pressure that you will have inside of the cargo rooms will try to push the doors open. The way that this had been solved on the DC-10 was that an electrical motor will drive a rod outwards. That rod will then turn a torque tube that will in turn lock into position 4 mechanical C-shaped locks. Now, when that rod was driven to its full extent position, one of the links would lock into an over-center position, resting on a stop. And when it came into that over-center position, it would essentially make the locking unreversible. Any force that was applied to these C-shaped locks would be transferred through this over-locking mechanism onto the stop, and it would stop there. But if for whatever reason the extension of this locking rod would stop prematurely, well, then the link will never reach its over-center position, and the whole locking mechanism would be able to be reversed, right? All of the forces that will be put onto these C-shaped locks will then be transferred not onto the mechanical stop that it was supposed to do, but onto the locking mechanism itself and its fastening bolts. The designers of the door understood that there was a risk in case something would happen to the electrical motor that was driving the locks, that this over-center position might not be achieved, and in that case there would be a danger of the door actually opening itself. So they've worked out a workaround where the actual handle of the door was connected to a torque tube That torque tube was connected to a door, a vent door in the door, that as long as the handle was open or not closed, that vent door was open, and that would stop pressurization inside of the cargo compartment. And then the handle was also further connected through linkages and some bell cranks onto a further torque tube, which had some locking pins on it. And the idea was that if the C-shaped lock had put themselves correctly into position, well then as you closed the door handle, these locking pins would lock into position and further secure the door. However, if for whatever reason the C-shaped locks was not in position, well then the locking pins would find themselves behind some metal flanges that was connected to the locks, and they couldn't get into position. And if that happened, then it would be impossible to actually put the door handle down. And this door mechanism was also connected to a indicator light in the cockpit. So as soon as the handle was put down properly, it closed the vent door in the door, and it also closed a circuit that would show the cockpit crew that the door had been properly locked. Another design feature of the DC10 was that the aft cargo compartment did not have any pressure relief vents connected to the passenger compartment above. And this is going to have a major influence on the events that's to come. American Airlines Flight 96 departed Los Angeles at time 14:36. That's about 46 minutes after its scheduled departure time. The delay was down to passenger handling and air traffic control restrictions. And the initial leg where they flew from Los Angeles over towards Detroit was uneventful. The crew landed in Detroit, where they offloaded a couple of passengers, took on some new passengers and fueled the aircraft, and then added some cargo. The last compartment to be secured was the aft cargo hold. The ramp service agent who was in charge of closing the aft cargo door had some problems closing it. He said that he let the electric engine go until it shut off itself, and then when he tried to close the handle, he realized that he couldn't really close it with the normal smooth way that he was used to. Instead, he had to put all of his force onto it and even use his knee to kind of push the handle into position. But when he did so, the handle did click into position, but he also realized that even though the handle was in the right position, the vent door on the door was still closed but in a slightly cocked position. I thought that was a bit weird, so he called over a mechanic who had a look at it and basically said, yeah, no, that looks okay, and released the aircraft back to service. With all the doors closed and the aircraft ready to go, the crew asked to get pushback clearance and a further taxi clearance into holding position for runway 03 right in Detroit. And at time 19:20, they received their takeoff clearance. Takeoff was uneventful. They climbed out initially to 6,000 feet, where they were handed over to the Area Control Center in Detroit, and they told them to continue climb to flight level 210 and join the airway Victor 554. The first officer was the pilot flying for the leg, and they continued climb normally. As the aircraft climbed through about 11,750 feet, all of the flight crew members simultaneously heard a large thump. When that happened, basically anything that was on the floor in the cockpit became airborne. So all of the dust and gravel came up and into the eyes of the pilots, momentarily blinding them. At the same time, the left rudder pedal moved to its full deflection position. The aircraft started to yaw to the right, and all three engines moved back towards idle. Now, Captain Bryce initially thought that they had hit something, that they had a mid-air collision. So as soon as his eyes were clear again, he took over the controls, he disconnected the automatics, and started trying to find out what was working and what wasn't in his aircraft. He very quickly realized that he had control of number 1 engine and the number 3 engine, basically the undermounted engine, but that the number 2 engine was not responding to any kind of thrust lever command. He also realized that he had full aileron control, but that the aircraft was yawing a lot to the right, and because he was doing that, he now had to input aileron towards the left in order to get the aircraft flying where he wanted to. So at this point, he was basically flying his aircraft in a constant side slip position. Now the pilots immediately understood that this was a really, really serious situation. So they called in a mayday call and asked to get vectors back towards Detroit Metropolitan Airport. At the same time, in the passenger cabin, both the cabin crew and the passengers could hear that loud thump. And as they heard that, this dense white greyish fog started appearing, and they could feel how the air of the cabin was rushing aft. The cabin crew knew that if you would see that kind of fog appearing, that was indicative of a sudden pressure drop. Because if you have moisture, which you always have in the air, and the pressure drops, well, then that moisture would turn into basically cloud. And that's what happened. So the cabin crew was looking out to see if the oxygen mask would be dropping. But since the aircraft was below 14,000 feet, which is where the automatic extension of those passenger oxygen masks would happen, they never dropped. But what was also happening at the same time was far more terrifying. So towards the back of the passenger cabin, which in American Airlines, there was actually no passenger seated. It was a lounge area with a stand-up bar. The whole floor of the passenger cabin started collapsing downwards into the cargo compartment. In the back of the aircraft, there were two cabin crew seated by their emergency exits. As the floor started collapsing downward, they were thrown down onto the floor and received some minor injuries. But this didn't stop them from carrying out their duty. They moved forward, and as they were moving forward, they were taking passengers and moving them away from the area of the floor that was collapsing. They reconvened up in the front of the cabin where they got into contact with the captain. The captain, obviously busy during this ordeal, basically just told them that they had to prepare for an emergency landing. And here is where you can see that the immense training and experience of the cabin crew started to kick in, because they immediately went into work mode. They started to brief the passengers not only about the emergency landing that was coming up, but also about the coming evacuation. They found what we called able-bodied passengers that could help in case one of the cabin crew would get hurt, and basically they were doing everything right. So fantastic job from the cabin crew leading up to the landing. Up in the cockpit, the pilots know that they're dealing with some severe problems with their aircraft, but they don't know how bad it is. They're still not sure whether or not they've had an in-flight collision, for example. They're still trying to check which systems are working. They've realized that their pitch control is severely affected. They can control the pitch, but the pitch control is very sluggish and it requires a lot of force in order to move the elevator up and down. They don't seem to have any stabilizer trim available, and because of all of these things combined, as they're talking to air traffic control, they're requesting a long final. This is a smart move because they don't know what kind of damage they have, and they don't know really what the aircraft is going to do as they start to configure it for landing. So asking for a long final far out at a higher altitude will enable them to kind of test the aircraft as they're going down. Air traffic control provides radar vectors for the aircraft to a 20 nautical miles final from runway 03 left. They intercept the localizer and the glide slope, and as they start descending, they're descending with about 800 feet per minute, which is normal when you're following a glide slope. But both the captain and the first officer and the flight engineer are unsure whether or not the landing gear is actually going to extend, and if it extends, whether or not it's going to be safe. They're also discussing whether or not they're going to dump fuel, but since they don't know how bad the damage to the aircraft is, they don't want to risk to be dumping fuel into something that, could potentially cause even more damage. So they choose not to dump any fuel. Now, as they're getting closer to the airport, they're starting to finalize the configuration of the aircraft. They select the gear down, then they select the flaps down to the landing flap, flap 35. And as they do so, the aircraft's descent rate starts to increase from 800 feet per minute, which they were before, to up to 1500 feet per minute. The captain knows that this is way too much, and he adds thrust on his undermounted engines in order to get the engines to help the aircraft to pitch up and control the descent rate. And this works. The downside of that is as you're adding thrust, you're obviously now also adding airspeed. So the aircraft is flying with landing flaps at 160 to 165 knots, which is a good 30 knots quicker than they normally would with that type of configuration. But they choose to continue with that because they have the pitch under control. And in a situation like this, controlling the aircraft and just getting it down to the ground and getting the aircraft to start to brake is the priority. They continued approach, and as they're getting into the landing flare, both the captain and first officer needs to input back pressure on their yoke in order to start the flare. They touched down at time 1944, that's 24 minutes after they took off. Immediately as the aircraft touches down, it starts veering towards the right side of the runway. Now, the captain has chosen reverse thrust, and as they start to veer, he is putting full aileron in towards the left. The first officer realizes that they're about to run off the runway, so he intervenes and he cancels the reverse thrust on the right-hand side and increases the reverse thrust to maximum on the left-hand engine. When he does so, this means that he's now providing asymmetrical reverse thrust. On the left-hand side, as the reverses is now deployed, it's starting to pull the aircraft back onto the runway again. So he managed to get the aircraft under control, and they slowly come to a complete stop, about 2,800 meters in on the runway. When they come to a stop, both the left main gear and the nose gear is still on the runway. The right main gear is out on the grass, and they immediately push for the evacuation alarm to go, which initiate the evacuation. And the evacuation is done really smoothly. It's the 6 emergency exits that are available are being used. The 2 aft emergency exits cannot be used because the floor has collapsed in that area. But everyone gets out alive. It is a true miracle and a statement through the professionalism of not only the flight crew but also the cabin crew. So what has actually happened here? Well, it became immediately apparent to the air crash investigation team that the aft left cargo door was completely missing from the aircraft. That door was found quite quickly out in a field, and it was brought in for examination, and when they looked at it, they could see that all of the 4 C-shaped locks, they had partially locked, but the linkage was never in the over-center position. And because it never went into the over-center position, it meant that when force was applied to these locks, that force was not transferred onto the stops as it was supposed to do. Instead, it was transferred onto the mechanism itself and the bolts that held the mechanism in place. And at a certain pressure, those bolts sheared off, and when that happened, that released the door outward. The door then was hit with the air loads, which ripped it off the aircraft. It was never really established why the locking mechanism hadn't extended fully and put the linkage into the over-center position. There had been a service bulletin sent out by McDonnel Douglas about a month before this incident, talking about beefing up the electrical wiring to the motor. That could potentially have been the reason for it, but that was not really the point. The point here to the investigation team was that there was supposed to be a fail-safe in the door locking mechanism. You weren't supposed to be able to close the door handle if the linkage was not in the overcooked position and the locking pins were not in. So when they started looking into the door mechanism, they realized that it wasn't really strong enough. You could, if you applied enough force onto the door handle, you could force it into position by essentially bending one of the torque tubes, the one that was connected to the door vent. And if you did so, the handle would lock into position, the door vent would not fully close but partially close, and the other torque tube would be moved enough to close the circuit in order to show in the cockpit as the door was actually closed. But the locking pins that were supposed to be there to fail safe, to make sure that the locks would not move out of position, they were never activated. And remember how we talked earlier about the fact that there was no pressure relief kind of connection between the lower cargo hold and the passenger cabin? Well, what that meant was that when the door blew off, the cargo compartment immediately depressurized. But because there was no connection, because there was nowhere from the air in the passenger cabin to escape in and depressurize itself, that differential pressure that you now had between the passenger cabin and the cargo hold started to push up against the floor itself. And the floor was never built to take those kind of forces. So it started collapsing in towards the cargo hold area to basically let the air go somewhere. And what did we have inside of the passenger floor? The control cables and pulleys to both the flight controls in the vertical stabilizer and the horizontal stabilizer and the number 2 engine. So as the passenger floor started collapsing inwards, this severely damaged and moved the control cables, causing the deflection of the rudder pedal in the cockpit and causing the rudder to turn the aircraft towards the right, also severely restricting the elevator control cables. It also shut down engine number 2, and all of this together explained the flight control problems that the crew had after the initial depressurization. After the investigation team came to the following conclusion. Probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the improper engagement of the latching mechanism for the aft bulk cargo compartment door during the preparation of the airplane for flight. The design characteristics of the door latching mechanism permitted the door to be apparently closed when, in fact, the latches were not fully engaged and the lock pins were not in place. They gave 2 very specific recommendations. 1. Require a modification to the DC10 cargo door locking system to make it physically impossible to position the external locking handle and vent door to their normal door locked positions unless the locking pins are fully engaged. 2. Require the installation of relief vents between the cabin and aft cargo compartments to minimize the pressure loading on the cabin flooring in the event of a sudden depressurization of the cargo compartments. Now, the wording in that conclusion and those recommendations clearly indicate that what the NTSB was looking for here is something called an AD, an Airworthiness Directive. This is when basically an aircraft manufacturer together with the licensing authority goes out and states that this has to be done. Right? It's within a reasonable time frame. These modifications has to be done in order for the aircraft to remain airworthy. But for whatever reason, that never happened. Instead, a service bulletin, which is a much weaker kind of directive, was issued, basically instructing airlines to insert kind of a support bracket around the torque tube at the top of the door that would stop the torque tube from bending, and basically complying with the first recommendation from the NTSB. When it came to the second recommendation, McDonnel Douglas was looking into the feasibility of actually installing these type of vents, but it wasn't something that was mandated to happen. I also want to send a huge thank you to the sponsor of this episode, which is NordVPN. Now, I use NordVPN myself, especially when I'm out traveling to, through airports or restaurants where I might be using local Wi-Fi's. It's very good to know that my data will not be able to trace when I do so, but to be perfectly honest, what I use it the most for is to get past these pesky regional restrictions when it comes to Netflix, for example. By the click of a button, I can just change my location to be in the United States, and there's loads more and better TV shows to watch there. If you are interested in this, then use the link here below. That link will give you a whopping 70% discount on the 2-year deal with NordVPN. And you can use that deal to up to 6 different devices on the same deal. So go down, click the link, and consider supporting me by supporting them. Guys, I hope that you are finding this series about famous incidents and accidents in the aviation history fascinating. And if you are, I hope that I have earned a subscription from you. Now, if you want to subscribe, then click the subscribe button and also highlight the notification bell, so you make sure that you get a notification anytime that I send out a new video. And I would also love to hear from you. What do you think? What is the next incident you would like me to cover? Put it into the comments below, or contact me in the Mentour Aviation app or the free Discord server. All right, I'm going to link to it up here. You can just click on it, get either the app or the Discord server, and contact me. I love hearing from you guys. Until next time, have an absolutely fantastic day. Oh, and I forgot to tell you guys, because that Airworthiness Directive was never issued, next week we'll be talking about a very similar but far more terrifying accident.